This is an ABC podcast.
Hello, Arnold Zabel here. Welcome to Earshot and our series You Are Not Alone, 100 Years of PEN International. PEN speaks out for writers who've been imprisoned for practising their craft, for pursuing the truth. And in this episode, we're going into one of the harshest prisons in Southeast Asia with Marthida. Claudia Taranto tells the story of this remarkable Myanmar writer and surgeon who used mindfulness meditation to get through her time in jail.
The weather is fine right now. It's sunny.
Over a few nights, always around midnight, from an apartment somewhere outside of Myanmar, Marthida told me her story. She's gone into hiding there after the military coup in February this year. Her life has traversed the violent political landscape of her home.
Authorities use force against any protesting monks.
Hundreds were slaughtered as troops fired on demonstrators.
In fact, her earliest memory is of government-orchestrated rioting against the local Chinese population.
At the age of 1, I was on my mom's arms. I remember the feeling of fear and desperate of my mom and her tears. Violent conflict is going on. So, yeah. My childhood, it started from this direction.
In 1988, she was at university studying medicine, and Myanmar was ruled by a severe socialist government. But nobody expected the military to open fire on a group of students protesting about the price of tea. Marthida, like so many others, took to the streets.
Thousands of people protesting in Rangoon against the government of new leader Sein Lwin. The tape recording. At that time, I was trying to be among the protesters, but it was not very easy, because of the crackdown. My parents were a little bit reluctant to let me go. Bloody crackdown by the security forces. But on the 10th August, there was another incident of shooting into the Rangoon General Hospital. Some diplomats say several nurses and a doctor may have been killed when troops opened fire. The protest lasted for more than a month and so many different parts of the country.
I think that it would be easier to say that there are some areas where law and order has fallen down and where ordinary government control of law and order is now absent.
And then, making this as an excuse, they declared the military coup on September 18, 1988.
Today, the capital Rangoon is reported to be empty of citizens with large numbers of troops patrolling the streets.
Theda threw herself into the fledgling democracy movement that emerged out of the protests. She worked closely with Aung San Suu Kyi and her party, the National League for Democracy, the NLD.
Marthida, she's an incredibly principled and determined and also very efficient person.
Vicky Bowman first met Marthida in the Yangon literary scene 30 years ago.
I first met her when I was in an earlier posting in Myanmar as the Second Secretary in the British Embassy. So she was introduced to me as someone who could help me with what was my particular passion at the time, which was trying to dig up censored writing and also meet up with artists and writers and poets who at the time were some of the main members of the opposition, or what was left of it.
Marthida had been writing fiction since she was a teenager. Mostly short stories.
I love the language. I just fall in love with the language.
And at the time, the editor Myo Myint Nyen thought her work stood out from the crowd.
Unlike
other young writers, her work wasn't just based on her own experience, but also historical fact. She made the reader think. It was a bit abstract, but unique. She's a good writer.
She also wrote a novel called The Sunflower, which was based around Aung San Suu Kyi and the way the people of Myanmar had idolised her, made her a prisoner of applause. Like all writing in Myanmar, it had to be submitted to the censors.
The censorship process in Myanmar at the time, which was the early 90s, was incredibly strict, and the censors very much took the view that if they didn't understand it, they would probably call for it to be ripped out. You'd pick up magazines in the streets where the articles had been censored, and maybe you'd find there was a sort of a black pen through them, or later on they started using silver pens as well, or they'd have stuck the pages together, or sometimes they just ripped the whole article out.
But fiction writers, including Theda, used allegory to get around the censors.
And what Theda particularly enjoyed was when they'd managed to get those past the censors out onto the streets, and then the word had got around in the literary community that, you know, this particular story had this particular meaning. I think everybody felt that they'd therefore put one over on the censors, and it was a victory.
A year after the coup, the military held elections.
In Myanmar, the ruling military junta has showed no willingness to hand over power to the opposition following its crushing election win 7 weeks ago.
There were protests, followed by shootings. People were disappeared. Writers and poets were not spared. Aung San Suu Kyi was jailed, and Ma Thida went underground. Feeling guilty about still being free, she supported the families of her friends who'd gone to prison.
The survivor guilt made me more dedicated to their family members. I need to take care of them on behalf of them. So it was really pretty hard, keeping the revolution and earning my medical degree at the same time.
The ruling junta told the world that there were no political prisoners in Myanmar. At the time, Mel Myint Yin was serving a 14-year sentence for writing a poem critical of the government. He'd heard about a UN human rights conference being held in Vienna and wanted to send a message there. He wrote it on a shirt and smuggled it out to Ma Thida.
We wrote our message on one of our prison uniforms asking for support for the democracy movement in Myanmar. And then a prison guard who was sympathetic to our cause smuggled it out for us. We took a huge risk by doing that, but the Burmese delegation at the conference were forced to admit that there were political prisoners in Myanmar.
And then one night, the military came for Ma Thida. She was blindfolded, interrogated, and then sent to insane prison. But being a writer, she was in two minds about it.
So it was a pretty much mixed feeling. On one hand, I was a bit happy. Now I'm having the chance, as my colleagues do, writing my own prison memoir, experiencing this new experience. But the prison environment was unbelievable. People are not like people, especially their language, the way they speak, the way they use the vocabulary, the way they act. It was so unbelievable for me, you know. For very first week, it was really unbearable.
Insane Prison is the largest prison in Myanmar. It's a colonial era prison. It's one of these panopticons that were established by the Victorian era. It has a reputation for being overcrowded and underfunded, so families always have to send in extras, they have to send in medicine, and where they didn't have families, then they were reliant on other prisoners to help support them. So there was a lot of solidarity within the prison of sharing of food and medicine and mental support. Theda told me, though, that it was, she was always, particularly in the early days before she was put in solitary confinement, that there was quite a lot of political debate within the prison, and she found it quite frustrating, the arguments that went on with the members of the Burma Communist Party who were also in there.
She became friends with the woman in the cell next to her, named Ma Chu, also a political prisoner. Reading was forbidden, but Ma Chu was well connected. She managed to get around that rule.
Her family is very well-to-do. They bribed the guards to smuggle in some books and things. The reading was the most privileged luxury.
Did you have to hide your reading?
Oh, sure. They asked all the prisoners to sleep at 9 p.m. So after 9 p.m., I started reading at the corner where I cover my body with a sort of blanket or something, So underneath, I try to read the whole book in the sitting position. Early morning, when the prison starts opening, I try to send the book back to Machu through our secret pulley system. If I couldn't send the book back to the cell next to me where Machu is, I normally kept that book inside the toilet bowl.
At her trial, Marthita was sentenced to 20 years.
7 years for endangering public serenity, 3 years for conducting illegal organization, 5 years plus 5 years for printing and distribution of illegal materials, so altogether 20 years imprisonment.
Before she went into prison, she already had bad health, anorexia, and then in prison, she got tuberculosis. After 6 months of severe pain, they finally sent her to hospital, but for only...
It was less than 24 hours. They don't want me to be exposed to the outside world, so without having any treatment, even any examination, I was sent back to the prison.
By now, Marthita was feverish and weak, but she went on a hunger strike, refusing to return to her cell until she got proper medical treatment. And then a high-ranking prison officer said something she really didn't expect to hear.
He told me, Marthita, you are free, but we are not. So I responded, how dare you can say I'm free? And this prison officer said, you are free in your thoughts and your words. We are not, since we are the civil servants.
His comments confirmed for Marthita why she had to keep fighting for freedom of expression in Myanmar.
Even though my physical security has been under their control, they won't ever arrest my mind and my words.
And outside Myanmar, the world started watching Marthita.
She was quite a high-profile prisoner, and she said afterwards that she felt that the support that she got from letter-writing campaigns from Amnesty and from PEN International and others had helped to raise the profile of her case, and therefore it meant that the authorities were not wanting to let her die, so they were giving her better treatment than perhaps some of her peers were getting.
To this day, she's never seen any of the letters people sent her. But she did hear that there were so many of them that the Department of Foreign Affairs created a full-time job just for someone to process them. And the world kept watching and pushing for Marthita's release.
Let it be said by our daughters and our sons, and by the future generations, that the Fourth World Conference for Women in Beijing was a turning point towards genuine equality, development, and peace.
At the huge International Women's Conference held in Beijing in 1995, delegates from PEN International drew attention to her case by celebrating Marthita's 29th birthday. But back in insane prison, she had no idea this had happened. And her father only found out when a friend who heard about it asked him whether his daughter had been to Beijing.
So my father started talking about this issue, and he found it out. My birthday was celebrated in Beijing at the Fourth World Women's Convention, and the irony is, the junta, military junta, sent all 3 men to attend this World Women's Convention. And they noticed my 29th birthday was celebrated. So I really appreciate the way the international community tried to show not just solidarity, but also the evidence for the junta's wrongdoing.
Marthita grew up practicing Buddhism, but in prison she wanted to deepen her knowledge.
I know how to meditate just theoretically, but I also smuggle in some more meditation books through Machu. So I have been reading very thoroughly,
And her study made her think about how much control she had over her situation.
I started asking myself, for my physical release, I'm not the one who can decide, nor who can make things happen. Only one thing I do need is just myself. So for having total freedom, not just from prison, but also from the life cycles, samsara, I decided to practice meditation.
Breathing, breathe out, breathing, breathe out. Oh, footsteps. Who could that be? Must be the nasty guard.
How many hours did you do it each day?
Well, up to 20 hours. That made me really liberated.
Breathe in, breathe out. Which cell is she going to? Breathe in, breathe out. Why didn't I hear the key in the lock?
And how did you do it in a prison, in a noisy, distracting, busy place?
Well, having mindfulness needs not to be silent. The mindfulness is to be mindful about the noisiness, to be mindful about all such positive or negative things. To be mindfulness is to be present. That's all we need. So I just focus on my mindfulness, not focus on any kind of excuses not to practice.
Breathe in, breathe out. Who's she talking to? Breathe in, breathe out. Please, please, I hope it's not a problem for anyone. Breathe in, breathe out.
And how did it change the way you dealt with the guards?
The way I face them is so much less in anger, so much less in bitterness. After meditation, I become someone who try to solve the problems together with the others, rather than solve the problems from myself.
Oh, my mind slipped away again. I'm thinking, breathe in, breathe out.
And then I look things as more indifferent than ever, In the past, this is good and this is bad. And I'm happy with the good things and I'm sorry with the bad things. But after learning about there is impermanence, there is suffering, I became pretty much indifferent either to the good or bad things, because both are impermanent, both are suffering. So the acceptance to things as it is make me more peaceful.
And through her Buddhist practice, her compassion grew.
A lot of prisoners were so much in despair, They are treated not even as human beings by the prison guards, nor the fellow prisoners who have more money. So I try to help them, even though they are prostitutes or they are anyone, I try to help them. I try to treat their wounds. I try to give them the food. I try to share my clothes with them. I have so much sympathy after learning so many stories from them, and I can see the real crime is not by individual, but by the system.
Even the spiders in her cell benefited from her compassion.
There are so many spider webs in my cells, and I try to neglect them. The prison officer, she noticed it, and she said, "Why don't you clean it?" I just said, I couldn't be with my family members in my own home. How can I dare to destroy the other people's home? So she didn't say any words and run away.
Her parents were allowed to visit once a fortnight, and that was how Theda found out about what was going on in the outside world. But they often had to speak together in English in these visits, so that the guards couldn't understand what they were saying.
It was very much messages that would effectively be being passed through the visits that family members had. And these visits were heavily surveyed by the guards. I mean, it was 15 minutes and there was somebody standing there the whole time. So these were really barely anything other than an opportunity for families to give family news. And again, somewhat like censorship, sort of coded messages about the outside world and politics.
And then Marthida developed endometriosis.
Intense pain, grabbing pain, is a soaking pain, deep-seated pains, almost 12 hours per day I suffer. But luckily, because of the meditation, I can manage this pain with my mindfulness, even though the pain doesn't go away, but I notice more about how much even these kind of intense pain is impermanence. Without meditation, I wouldn't bear this pain.
The military were worried that Theda might die on their watch, and so, without any notice, after 5.5 years in prison, she was released on humanitarian grounds. One of the first people she went to see was Aung San Suu Kyi, who was under house arrest by then. Between each of their prison terms, it had been 10 years since they'd seen each other.
For some moments, both of us couldn't speak. Both of us were in tears. We don't know why. I keep saying to her, it has been almost 10 years.
Vicky Bowman was keen to see her friend Marthida when she was next able to enter the country. She remembers her being thinner than when she went into prison. Vicky's since made a life in Myanmar. She's married to Tain Lin, an artist who was also a political prisoner around the same time as Marthida.
Going to prison was a rite of passage for anybody in Myanmar who was fighting for democracy and human rights. For each of them, both for Theda and for my husband, prison became a useful experience for their art. In Theda's case, she's written her prison memoirs. I think she had much sort of inspiration for future writing projects while in jail. For my husband, he was doing a number of prison paintings on uniforms and smuggling them out. And these have become very much a backbone of his art outside. So for those in Myanmar who have strong mental constitutions and often who bolster that, as Theda did, as my husband did, through meditation practice while in jail. I think prison is something to survive, but it's also something which leaves in a way, a positive impact on their ability to function, whether it's artistically or politically in the future.
After prison, Theda's writing practice changed. She largely turned away from fiction and took up writing memoir and commentary instead. But, she says, it wasn't her prison experience that changed her writing.
I don't think prison changed me. Meditation changed me. Being mindful, it's very hard to have too much extreme feeling. So for writing fictions, we do need rather strong emotion to making brilliant writing in fiction. It's harder and harder for me to having extreme emotion because of the very strong meditation practice. I couldn't have that much extreme emotion.
Did you feel that you had lost something in not being able to experience those emotions?
No, I don't. I'm happy with that, to be frank, because my writings is obviously changed after I was released. But I'm happy with this change.
Before
she went into prison, she was a tomboy. She didn't care much about what other people thought of her. And she was a loner. I guess in prison, she couldn't survive as a loner. You'd go mad if you didn't talk to other people. It made her a better political organizer.
Myo Myint Yin, Ma Thita's publisher. She went on to work closely with him, editing a monthly news magazine right through the opening up of Myanmar and the election of Aung San Suu Kyi. And together, she and Myo Myint Yin established PEN Myanmar.
They had a small office in the centre of Yangon, very noisy from the street outside, where they would have talks about different aspects of literature, including, in particular, ethnic minority literature. And I remember going along to the first of these talks and actually sort of crying because it felt so good to see that, for all that Theda had been through all that the country had been through, we were now at a point where she could open up a chapter of the organisation that had been advocating for her freedom when she was in jail. So it was a very emotional moment for me anyway, I think for her as well.
And then on the morning of the 1st of February this year,
Myanmar's military moved in before dawn with coordinated raids in cities and regions. Their main target was the country's leader Aung San Suu Kyi, followed by other senior government...
And what's followed the coup has been months of violence, protests, arrests, killings.
There was just atrocities, just brutality. Just murder, killing. Even if they cannot find the person they want to arrest, they started arresting the family members. They have been looking for one guy, they couldn't find him, and they arrested his daughter, 5 years old. What it is? 5 years old girl being arrested on behalf of her father.
Since the coup, 75 children have been killed and more than 1,000 detained, according to the UN Child Rights Committee. And censorship has also returned.
The military tried to ask the commuters on the street to open their mobile phone. They check our photo gallery, they check our Facebook pages. If they see the protest, anything related to the protests, either the photo, either the post, you can be arrested, you can be shooted.
In certain cities, you have explosions being let off, which are often just sound bombs, but which then often lead then to a vicious clampdown on the part of the authorities with soldiers and police going out onto the street and firing into houses and into apartments, raids on houses to arrest people. There's a very divided atmosphere now between those who are perceived as being informers and those who are perceived as being opposition, and that's leading to a lot of of arrests and extrajudicial killings on both sides. And the COVID third wave hit very strongly in July, August, and in particular has hit obviously a lot of the older community, including the artists and writers communities. So we've lost perhaps 130 plus artists, musicians in their 50s, 60s, 70s.
After the coup, lists of undesirables were circulated by the military. Theda's name was on one of them. With the help of PEN International, she's now safe outside of the country. And for Myung Mit Nyen, with all his editors in hiding, he's had to close down his publishing house. And now he's just waiting.
At my age, I can't go on the run, and besides my health is failing. But I've made up my mind that if they come for me, I'm ready to go back to jail. I'm not criticising the military or doing anything to upset them. Even ordinary Myanmar people, living in their own homes, minding their own business, they're just as likely to be killed at any time. I'm just one of them.
And for Ma Thida, the people of Myanmar's journey towards democracy is far from over. In 2011, she published a book called The Roadmap that told the story of the country since those first protests in 1988. But she was worried the book might be banned and her writing career in Myanmar would be over. So she published under a pseudonym.
Pseudonym is called Surakamika. You know, the book is really all about our long journey. Never-ending journey. So Surakamika means brave traveler. We are all traveler. We keep traveling. We are still on the march.
Ma Thida, Prisoner of Conscience, was produced by Claudia Taranto with technical production by John Jacobs. Next in our Earshot series about imprisoned writers, you'll meet Stella Nyanzi, an audacious poet from Uganda, whose work bristles with criticism of those in power. But she wonders, would beautiful poems dethrone a tyrant? I'm Arnold Zabel. I hope you can join me then.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.